had a crush on Miss Julia, the teacher who supported me because she was so nice and kind. At the moment, the sound of her lecture came from the empty classroom. I stood outside the classroom, sweaty and creepy. That's Miss Julia, but she hanged herself. I was the last person to arrive at Miss Julia's dormitory. The sun is hot outside. The gloomy air in the dormitory came over me, drilling into my bone marrow, and I instantly winced. Miss Julia's body found by the students who sent her off. The teachers live in the teachers' dormitory, which is in a state of disrepair and often leaks and loses power. The students knew that Mrs. Julia was back in town today and arrived at school early to wait. When the teacher did not come out at the time, the students went to the dormitory and knocked on the door. The young ones could never have imagined it. Upon opening the door to the dormitory room, he was met with a surprisingly ebony corpse. Miss Julia hung in midair, her body as stiff as a dead fish. His face was blue, his eyes bulged out, and his expression was beyond hideous. Like they went through unimaginable torture before they were born. I stood in the doorway of my dormitory, my eyes red and my fists clenched. The body on the beams of the room yesterday was still telling me to study hard and to get out of the mountains. The students were dispersed to their homes, and the only people left at the scene were parents with different looks on their faces. A nice girl, why did she suddenly want to go away? The principal of the village school shook his head and sighed. It's almost time to go back to the city. Why is this necessary? The parents' faces were full of doubt and confusion, but more than anything else, they were annoyed and apathetic. No one ever bullied her, so why did she hang herself? That's right, he died in the school dormitory. He scared my baby. This girl from the city is so delicate that she can't stand to stay one more semester. It's not like she doesn't get paid. They murmured, grumbling in their tones. The village school has a chronic shortage of teachers, and the university students who teach there all come for one semester and then leave. Miss Julia decided to stay for 6 more months because her heart ached for the children. The villagers were a little upset when they said they were leaving earlier. She died suddenly and horizontally, leaving her students with no one to teach them, and the resentment of her parents intensified. That's enough, shut up. With tears in my eyes, I pushed through the crowd and walked over to Miss Julia's body. She still wears the grass bracelet I hand-knit on her wrist, and her teachings to me still ring in my ears. Suddenly, a loud noise came from the sky. Boom! Thunder exploded and everyone trembled in fear. Then with a click, the beams snapped and Miss Julia's body plummeted down. I didn't even have time to dodge as Miss Julia's twisted face fell in front of my eyes. The strong smell of blood made me cough so violently that I couldn't catch my breath. The parents on the sidelines paled, fear mingling on their faces. Let's all disperse. School will be closed for a few days while we deal with the aftermath of Miss Julia. The principal's words were like a lifesaver, and the parents left in a hurry as if they had been pardoned. I stood alone in my dormitory, chilled to the bone. Miss Julia clearly told me she was happy to be back in town. How can you suddenly kill yourself? The heavy rain came swiftly, and the gloomy sky was swallowed up by the darkness of the night. I carefully arranged the body for Miss Julia. The village is secretive and shuns Miss Julia, who died horribly. I decided to hold a wake for Miss Julia. During the night, in a daze, I felt someone knocking on the door. When I snapped my eyes open, there was nothing. I walked to the door of my dormitory and closed it tightly. Just as I was about to go back to the eldritch light, an icy chill suddenly struck me from behind, and cold sweat instantly broke out. The principal and parents had all left during the day and the door was clearly closed. My sleepiness vanished instantly and my whole body shuddered uncontrollably. I stiffened and turned my head, my gaze fixed on Miss Julia's body. She lay still, pale as paper, and did not move at all. I took a deep breath and forced myself to calm down. Closing my eyes, I whispered a prayer for Miss Julia, repeating over and over in my mind what she had said to me. Just then, a pale yellow light shot through the dormitory window. I was all too familiar with the light. It came from the lamps in the schoolroom. Along with the lights came a muffled sound. The voice was mournful and tragic, like the cry of a ghost, hitting my eardrums and giving me the creeps. I stride out of my dorm room and run to the lighted classroom. The voice gradually became rhythmic and staccato. The last classroom, I finally heard the voice when I arrived. Inside the empty classroom, someone was lecturing. I turned, my body instinctively trying to leave, but my hand was on the classroom door. Crunch. The classroom door opened without warning and the lights and sounds disappeared in a flash. The classroom was dark, like a hibernating beast, and too cold to take another step inside. The voice of this lecture is Mrs. Julia's, but she's dead. My feet felt like they were firmly nailed to the ground and I couldn't take half a step at all. In the following days, the eerie lecturing voice appeared every day on time, echoing through the night. It spread from the school to the entire village, devouring everyone's sanity. It took until 3 o'clock in the middle of the night for the sound to die down, leaving a dead silence. A few days later, everyone in the village wore bloodshot eyes, pale faces, and a haggard, ghostly look. Fear spreads like a plague, quietly eating away at everyone's mind. The principal of the village elementary school was the first to be unable to withstand the invisible oppression, and his spirit began to break down. The principal lives near the school. I was able to catch glimpses of Mr. Julia on campus from time to time during his wake. He always looks shifty and hiding whenever he sees me, like he was afraid of being approached by my death-stained self. After a few days of running around and with the support of the parents, the principal was able to raise a sum for the funeral expenses. After all, Ms. Julia had an accident at school, so it's only logical to help. He barely managed to squeeze a stiff smile on his face. Despite the cool weather, his forehead kept sweating. I stood guard at the door to Mrs. Julia's dormitory and watched the assembled parents. They were indifferent to Mrs. Julia's funeral and more concerned about when school would open. It's really not a good time for this college student to die. It's almost the beginning of the school year, and he's delaying the children's classes. If she really wanted to leave, why did she stay for one more summer and die in the school? Who would dare to come to teach in the future? It's really bad luck. If I'd left earlier, there wouldn't have been any more of this shit. Anger burned in my chest as I listened to the parents. Wolf heart and soul. Mrs. Julia taught your children for nothing. The following day, Ms. Julia's funeral is held as scheduled, and the principal gets a one-eyed half-immortal in the funeral cortege. The funeral party blew in and made their way to Mrs. Julia's dormitory. The principal reached out to push the door open, and the one-eyed half-immortal child suddenly stopped him. The half-immortal stared at my face for a long time. What are you to the dead man? Me, she's my teacher. The dormitory was even colder than usual, and chills drilled into my marrow from all sides. Ms. Julia lay quietly on the bed, her lips as crimson as blood and her skin as pale as paper. The day she first died, her face was blue and her eyes bulged out in a creepy way. A few days passed, but her face slowly improved, just like a living person. The closer I got to her body, the colder and more bone-chilling I felt. The half-immortal child draws a charm on his hand and follows me into the dormitory. Scrutinizing Ms. Julia from head to toe, the half-immortal suddenly blanched. Where are the corpse's shoes? Did he not wear them when he died? The principal turned his attention to me. He's been here at the wake, ask him. It's dressed, I replied. Half-immortal's face went white and his voice suddenly raised. That's over, something big is going to happen. He took a few steps back looking terrified. Have there been any strange occurrences at school in the last few days? As soon as the half-fairy child's words left his mouth, the principal and the parents' expressions changed drastically. That horrible lecturing voice was like a woozy magical sound that haunted everyone to death. Upon hearing the villager's affirmative answer, the half-immortal's brow furrowed into a pimple. That teacher's obsession with teaching was so deep that he continued to teach after his death. Dead people don't need to walk, so naturally they don't need shoes. Still taking classes after death? My head booms like an explosion. The parents looked at each other with horror on their faces that they simply couldn't hide. That girl doll died and stayed in school? In the crowd, an old man with white hair and eyebrows came forward trembling, his eyes full of fear. The half-immortal child nodded slightly, affirming the old man's words. This female corpse died in vain, with a deep sense of grievance at the time of her death. His tone was extraordinarily serious and he signaled the crowd to stand back. This room is already in the Tyene position, and the Yin energy has been accumulating for a long time. This rain has cut off the Yang energy, so the female corpse will naturally be able to take on a new form after sucking in enough Yin energy. The crowd couldn't help but feel a pang of discomfort as the half-fairy's words made the air even more eerie. The principal's face was white and his lips trembled. Master Na, how should this plague be broken? He inquired eagerly. To solve this disaster, Half-Immortal's voice was as heavy as lead. We must isolate the female corpse's obsession. Otherwise, this disaster will be unavoidable, even to the point of slaughtering the village and destroying the seed. Kill the village and destroy the seed? When I heard the half-immortal child's words, I felt an inexplicable sense of relief in my heart. It's no shame to die for this group of people who don't know how to be grateful at all. The expressions of disgust that had been on the parents' faces tightened considerably. They obviously realized that their earlier offense to Ms. Julia was uncalled for. But some tough talkers won't relent. If she's dead, she's dead. What else can she do? Hurry up and cremate the body, that's what we're supposed to do. It's just a little girl, I'll see how big a wave she can make. As the crowd dispersed, I quietly found the half-immortal in the funeral procession and asked in a low voice. Immortal, as you can see, I'm afraid Miss Julia's death was unjustly blamed on something else. The words were not finished when the principal suddenly appeared. De Kiener, you must help me, the children still have to attend classes at the beginning of the school year, we can't afford any delays. The half-fairy sighed deeply and obliged the principal's request. I'll prepare it as soon as possible, as long as I can isolate the female corpse's obsession. This misfortune will be alleviated by half. Then I thank you in advance for the children. The principal finally left at ease, but I couldn't feel comfortable with how his back looked. Watching the silhouettes go away, the half-immortal waved his hand for me to leave as well. I had just turned around when a sentence drifted violently over. Whatever happens tonight, don't go into the classroom or Mrs. Julia. Leaving from the funeral cortege, I took 2 tight steps to try to catch up with the principal. But the principal was fleet of foot and avoided me like the plague. In the dormitory, Miss Julia's body is still at peace. Miss Julia came from a poor background and was an orphan like me, which is why she took extra care of me. The corners of my eyes moistened again as I thought of how much Miss Julia had cared for me in the past. Click, click. The clock turned and it was soon midnight. The warning I had received from the one-eyed half-immortal child during the day had sent a wave of inexplicable tension through me. I opened my eyes and opened the door to leave the dormitory silently. The night was thick, and the road to the school building became extraordinarily long. By the faint moonlight, I quickly made my way up to the 2nd floor. Opening the door to the last classroom, I stepped into the darkness. The nerves of the journey combined with the trotting, and before I knew it, my clothes were drenched in sweat. A sweaty tingle came from his wrist. I looked down and touched it and my heart skipped a beat. The grass bracelet on Miss Julia's wrist had somehow found its way into my hand. Frightened, I instinctively tried to turn away. The classroom, usually a few steps away, seemed to be a maze at the moment. Kirikou? The strange lecturing voice suddenly rang out, echoing in the darkness. I covered my ears tightly as the lectures remained clear and ferocious, coming from all directions. I leaned against the corner of the last row of the classroom, my heart pounding violently, the darkness before me about to consume me. Snappy, 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 snappy. A sharp sound of high heels came from far away and stopped at the door of the classroom I was in. Squeak. The door was pushed open. My vision blurred and eventually fell into darkness. When I woke up again, I found myself standing in the doorway of my classroom. My shoulders were a little heavy and I subconsciously tried to rub them, but I touched a cold hand. Gobble, gobble, gobble. A cold, soft laugh rang in my ears, and my cold hairs immediately stood up. In the sparse moonlight, I could see the shadow behind me. A familiar figure floated behind me. Miss Julia. There was no obvious malice in her voice, she just kept urging me to come downstairs. Where to? The only place to go is the dorms. I took 1 step down the stairs and quickly returned to the dormitory near where Miss Julia's body was parked. Julia-sensei on the back suddenly pulls on my ear and is telling me to stop. The thin sound of conversation came from inside the house, and I realized it was alerting me to the fact that there was someone in the room. That bitch, she's so stubborn. If she wasn't dead, we couldn't do anything about her. Don't talk nonsense, it's important to find something, it's not easy for that dull boy to go out. What's the point of having all this when the man's dead? The talking was dull and rough and it was evidently a couple of men talking. Behind her, Miss Julia suddenly screamed and flew into the room. Immediately afterward, several mournful screams resounded through the house. Fraud. Fraud. Somebody help. Fuck off and let me go first. After a panicked rattle, the door to the dormitory was pushed open with great force, and the 3 shadows fled with their asses in the air. As I hid in the shadows, I seemed to see a floating figure manifest at the entrance to the dormitory, radiating a suffocating chill. The floating shadows came straight at me. I felt like I was being viciously choked by a pair of invisible hands and my head was getting more and more foggy. The beating of the heart grew louder and louder, to shatter the eardrums. I desperately tried to escape, tried to get away from the dormitory, but my arms and legs felt like they were imprisoned, pressed and out of control. It was like cotton was stuffed in his throat and he couldn't make half a sound. In the next instant I was completely unconscious. When I woke up, I found myself in Miss Julia's dorm room. On the bed, Miss Julia's corpse was no different than before. I hurriedly looked at my wrist, only to realize that the grass bracelet was gone. Was it all just a sleepwalking hallucination? I tried to make sense of last night's memories, but everything was a blur and I wasn't sure I'd actually been to class. The next day, the one-eyed half-immortal child arrived as promised. Before he could reach the door to the dormitory, he stopped abruptly. After drawing a few talismans on his chest, the half-immortal child grimaced. What's going on? This female corpse's grievances are several times heavier than before. The half-immortal's words had a fear that could not be hidden, and a few drops of cold sweat appeared on his forehead. What was the accident last night? Did anyone come into the house? The half-immortal child looked around the room, and there was a deep questioning and reproach in her words. The eyes of the principal and the parents turned to me in unison. As you all know, I'm the one who does all the work at the wake. A few glances flickered in front of my eyes, clearly avoiding meeting my gaze. Thinking about the figure I saw outside my dorm last night, I caught my breath and clenched my fists. Is that them? I really didn't see the shadows for what they were. If we want to find those who did something to Miss Julia's body, we must hold back now. Half-Fairy didn't get the answer she was looking for, so she had to call it quits for now. After taking out his compass, the one-eyed half-immortal circled around the dormitory a few times before finally settling on a location. This is the place with the heaviest yang energy, so open a skylight here. There were handy masons among the villagers who quickly made a hole in the roof of the dormitory. The half-immortal drew bagua formations on the top and bottom of the skylight, along with a mahogany branch which looked very professional. The sunlight shone through the mahogany branches, right over Miss Julia's corpse, and the whole room lit up. The uncomfortable chill gradually dissipated, and the villagers on the sidelines finally dared to approach again. Thank you, Desienaire, for saving me. The principal shook the half-immortal's hand and thanked him profusely, and all that came out of his mouth was to thank him for the children. After completing all the spells, the one-eyed half-immortal child called me aside alone and handed me an ancient 8 trigrams mirror. You must keep this mirror close to you and never throw it away. The corpse's grievances have been suppressed by the yang energy, but they haven't been completely eradicated yet. Find a sunny day in a couple of days, and after you've completely exorcised her, this disaster will be over. I put away the gossip mirror and looked serious. 2 days later, the sky was clear and the sun was shining. The one-eyed half-immortal arrived again, and I touched the mirror in my arms with a heavy heart. He fished a worn doll out of his pocket and without a moment's hesitation walked over to Miss Julia's corpse. A thin needle with a thread pierced through the doll's body and into the forehead of Miss Julia's corpse. The doll's eyes stared coldly at us as the needles went deeper. It's like coming to life. The villagers stood nervously outside the door, staring at the half-immortal's every move with fear and curiosity written all over their faces. They whispered and waited for the final outcome of this ceremony. Miss Julia's corpse, guided by the needle and thread, slowly sat up and moved surprisingly like a living person. I vaguely sensed something was wrong, but in front of so many people, I didn't dare do anything rash. The half-immortal child pushed the tattered doll plaything firmly against the forehead of Miss Julia's corpse. Oh! A disgruntled scream exploded in his ears. I could hear it clearly. It was clearly Miss Julia's voice. I was just about to make a sound, but I realized that none of the expressions of the people around me had even changed. Am I the only one who hears it? The incantation tumbled out of the half-immortal child's mouth, and the doll's entire body began to turn black and shiny. The half-immortal was already sweating profusely and looked very overwhelmed. Miss Julia's corpse rapidly decayed before her eyes, and after a few moments, turned into a dry skeleton. The link between the incarnated obsession and the corpse has been severed, so as long as the grievances are dispersed you will be able to pass on to the next life without any problems. The one-eyed half-immortal wiped his sweat, and there was finally a hint of relief in his words. Stowing the doll, the half-fairy picked up the needle and thread that had pierced Miss Julia's forehead and tied the other end securely to the mahogany branch of the skylight. Outside the dormitory, parents were sticking their necks out one by one. They all breathed a sigh of relief after seeing the half-immortal child's face finally stop tensing up. The students have been out of school for a little over half a month since Mrs. Julia hanged herself. They are anxious to see the new semester begin. Now that the matter of Miss Julia has finally been dealt with, parents know that their dolls won't go without school. The half-immortal evicted everyone from the dormitory, slamming the door firmly behind them. He brought out a bowl of dark brown liquid and, brush after brush, began to draw huge runes on the 4 walls of the dormitory. His movements were calm and mysterious, and the air was filled with an odd aura. I stood in the doorway of my dormitory, holding a nameless rage in my chest. Miss Julia's corpse was thus suppressed and became an evil spirit. The charms on these 4 walls have the effect of gathering yang and dispersing yin, so you should keep a good eye on them. The half-immortal child handed me the remaining half-bowl of brown rune water and carefully instructed me. If the talisman shows any signs of blurring or fading, be sure to repair it immediately. Never open the door at night, no matter what noises you hear. I had half a bowl of charm water in my hand and Miss Julia's face in my head. The shadows that drifted out of my dorm room haunted me like a nightmare after I returned from class that night. Whenever night falls, Miss Julia's voice and smile would come back to me and I couldn't get any peace. The funeral party and the one-eyed half-centurion quickly left the village as if nothing had happened. The sound of lectures in the midnight classroom disappeared cleanly, and it was as if Mrs. Julia had never come to this branch. The new paraprofessionals who will be arriving in a few days have cleared the gloom from the parents' faces long ago. Really, it's all this college girl's fault for delaying it for so many days? If she knew she was going to commit suicide in the dormitory, she shouldn't have come here in the first place, and she's still scaring us to death. If you really want to die, you should die in the river, and now you're still occupying a dormitory wasting resources. Parents' curses pierced my heart like needles. I tried to ignore their voices and scrutinized the charms on the four walls of the dormitory every day. 2 nights later, strange noises came from the schoolroom. A patch of chalk writing inexplicably and automatically appeared on the blackboard in the classroom. The ear-piercing sound of chalk rubbing echoed through the deserted campus. Chilling and oozing. Scratching at the heart. The first person to notice the vision was the principal, who was inspecting his classroom and saw the board on the classroom blackboard unerased and tried to erase it. But when I walked into the classroom, I realized that the miserable white writing was increasing on its own. He was scared almost to death on the spot. The principal's terrified screams startled many of the surrounding villagers. The blackboard in the classroom is automatically sprouting words, as if someone invisible is writing with chalk. Parents sniffing around. School starts tomorrow and they don't want their dolls to encounter any more weirdness. On the blackboard, the handwriting rapidly became more and more, quickly filling the entire board from left to right. After about an hour, the handwriting finally stopped changing, as if the class had been dismissed at the end of the hour. Parents gathered outside the classroom door, afraid to enter easily. Finally, a bold parent picks up the chalkboard eraser and tries to erase the handwriting that appeared out of thin air. This handwriting seems to be imprinted into the brain after it has been erased. A couple of old men who couldn't read a word, after erasing a piece of handwriting, actually began to speak a few words of fluent English. The parents' horror and fear were fleeting, and shock and greed quickly took their place. What's the point of coming to school when you can erase all that handwriting and teach your kids when you've learned it yourself? Parents scramble to be the first, afraid of erasing less handwriting than others. Some people even wait right there in the classroom for their handwriting to be refreshed, like wild animals waiting for their prey. I didn't go up to fight for it, and my heart was only filled with sadness and silence. I recognized the handwriting on the blackboard at once. The handwriting was all too familiar, but people seemed to have willfully forgotten its owner. The writing that appeared on the blackboard, which only appeared in the evenings after the kids were out of school, was particularly eerie. Those classrooms, they're where Miss Julia used to be. The handwriting that spoke of her soul's inability to rest. Parents in the village were very exuberant and flocked to the school every night. It's a good thing that college girl died. Look at that. We can teach our own kids. If I had died earlier, I wouldn't have needed to ask my grandparents to come and teach me. The college students are just here for show, they don't mean well. They celebrated in a big way, reducing Miss Julia's kindness to a show of hypocrisy. Miss Julia was most concerned about me in the past days, and as I watched the villagers wreak havoc, I memorized their faces one by one. On the 3rd day after the writing appeared on the blackboard, the dog Rohan from the next village suddenly appeared in front of the village school. Dog Rohan had no hair, a round face and a fat belly, and raised a number of big ferocious dogs, hence the name. At the moment, he was holding a black dog more than half a man's height, and his expression was as gloomy as the night. Did you draw all these charms? When he came, I was mending the faded charms on the 4 walls of my dormitory. He stared dead at the talismanic water in my hand, his tone unkind. Flustered by his stare, I stopped what I'm doing. It was left behind by the one-eyed half-immortal child. Dog Rohan let go of the rope in his hand. The big black dog immediately let out a ferocious bark, its fangs bared and its expression fierce. It was hovering around the dormitory like it was sniffing for something. Circling the dormitory, the dog Rohan grinned a pointed grin and made an unspecified gurgling sound in his throat. Someone in this house died in vain, right? The grievances could have been resolved and the person could have passed on to the next life. But this gathering formation has been gathering chi these days, the corpse is already going to become stiff. Gathering a stalemate? How is that possible? The half-immortal's instructions to me were the opposite of what the dog Rohan was saying in front of me. An inexplicable fear shot through me and I took a step back, trying to get away from the dog Rohan. Don't talk nonsense here. Seeing that I didn't believe him, dog Luohan softened his tone and called the big black dog back. Don't be afraid. This person died in vain. I can let her go to heaven. She won't be tortured anymore. If you destroy the incantations on the 4 walls of the room, the formation will be broken, and she will be freed. I was a little confused and my mind was a jumble of weeds for a moment. Destroy the charm? What the dog Luohan said is exactly what the one-eyed half-immortal child urged me never to do. Them who's lying. And who is compelling. Two thoughts rolled violently through my mind at the same time, and I didn't know who to believe. It's impossible for me to destroy the talisman. The half-immortal said that once Ms. Julia's resentment dissipates, she will naturally be able to pass on to the next life. I forced myself to suppress the inner turmoil. Dog Luohan's face suddenly became gloomy, and there was a glint in his eyes that sent chills down one's back. His black dog pawed at the ground, ready to pounce, and there was an oppressive scent in the air. You're still too young? The dog Rohan sneered and cornered me. You believe whatever that half-fairy says, have you never doubted it? He just got rid of the obsession and this corpse is still here? Dog Luohan's tone was serious and icy. It made my otherwise firm thoughts start to waver. I seemed to be trapped in a maze from which there was no escape. So what you're saying is true? I braced myself, suppressed the fear inside me and stopped backing away. Even if not all of what Halfpenny said was true, the classroom lectures are gone now, and the matter has been settled. The dog Rohan squinted at me, his eyes full of contempt. Solved? That handwriting on the blackboard that appeared out of thin air and parents rubbed it and became as good as the teacher, that's how it's solved. Or don't you want to know the truth either? The words of the dog Rohan boomed in my ears like a great bell tolling. I haven't forgotten. Ms. Julia died in vain. The handwriting that appeared on the blackboard in that classroom was Ms. Julia's. I've seen what those parents look like when they erase their handwriting. Their mouths chanted and they looked numb, like they were being manipulated by some invisible force. Why on earth did those handwriting appear? I almost shouted. There was definitely no end in sight for Ms. Julia, and she wasn't happy about it. The dog Rohan's face was twisted like dried bark, unusually creepy. The handwriting on that blackboard is the result of the lingering resentment of this woman's corpse. Those handwriting can only appear at night because they cannot see the sunlight, and they will naturally dissipate in the daytime. Now that it's been wiped away in advance, the resentment goes into those people. His words hit me like a hammer. Accumulating day after day, those grievances will backfire when they reach a certain level. By then everyone will be dead. My whole body shuddered and cool air shot from the soles of my feet straight to my head. Those frenzied scenes of parents scrambling to erase their handwriting were like a nightmare. I'm still trying to resist the dog rocket talk, but my insides have long since faltered. The dog Rohan's patience seemed to be at its peak and he was unwilling to talk any more nonsense. When the female corpse's grievances take over the villagers' bodies, everyone will become monsters. Counting the days, Sanchi will be here soon. Then the corpse's een will reach its peak and it'll be too late. Sanchi, the third full day of the seventh day of a person's life. I snapped out of it. The brown talismanic water left behind by half-fairy child when she left was just about to be used up by that day, based on current consumption. It's definitely not a coincidence that it came together so well. Is the one-eyed half-immortal really hiding something from me? Or does he have something else in mind? Seeing that I never let go, dog Luohan no longer cared about me and directly led the big black dog away. The next day, just after dawn, I was awakened by the piercing sound of wailing. The screams of the village's students and the frantic voices of their parents mingled to create a suffocating noise. Like driven lunatics, parents stormed the school in a frenzy, tearing out their children's books and textbooks. Prickly, 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 prickly. Those books were torn to shreds, and the parents had no qualms about shoving the pieces into their mouths, their gills rapidly bulging with the sickening sound of chewing. Their expressions were twisted and frenzied, falling into utter madness. I watched in horror as parents fought over devouring books, their heads bleeding. Throughout the school, students had all their books ripped out and stuffed into their mouths by their parents. Those parents who erased the blackboard handwriting went crazy. That afternoon, the dog Rohan from the next village once again came uninvited. This time I didn't dare to slack off and hurriedly asked him to sit down. I have taken him at his word and just want to get this over with. There was a hint of gravity on the dog Rohan's face, and he looked around to make sure no one was there before beckoning me to come closer. Who hasn't touched the blackboard except you who hasn't erased the handwriting on it? His tone was heavy and urgent. I recalled in detail and finally realized there was one more person, the principal. That's right. The source of this corpse's resentment is him. I immediately shook my head, not being able to believe the dog Rohan at all. The principal was usually kind and loyal to everyone. The elementary school in the village was built by him, so how could it be harmful? But the serious look on the dog Rohan's face froze me for a moment. His tone was grim. Whether or not this corpse can rest in complete peace depends on whether or not we can find the real culprit. Dog Rohan's expression was grave. There is not much time left, you must hurry. Thinking about how kind Miss Julia had been to me in the past, I gritted my teeth and decided to take a chance. That night, the clouds were so dense that the moonlight was completely obscured, and the surroundings were as dark as ink. I held my breath and quietly felt my way to the southeast corner of the school's perimeter. The lights had long been out in the principal's house, and the room could not be seen. After waiting for half an hour, the room was still quiet. I was just about to leave when a click of the floor turning stopped me in my tracks. Immediately afterward, a sound of deliberately muffled footsteps rang out, and several hoarse, low voices followed. The buyer of the last vase was very satisfied and paid $500,000. Is there anything else like it? Someone wants it at a high price. Don't mention it, it was so close, who knows, people died. A $500,000 vase? My heart lurched. Other voices are muffled. But the second man who spoke, that familiar voice stuck in my mind like a brand. I held my breath and did my best to suppress the fear inside me as I took one step closer. Go listen to the muffled conversations clearly. Inside the room, the principal's voice was like the whisper of an evil spirit, full of sickeningly cold greed. She deserves to die. If she had been honest, she might have been sold to some rich family as a plaything. It's her fault for being smart enough to find out about our business and threaten to call the police. She's looking for death. I hid behind the base of the wall, first in a cold sweat, then in my mind was burning rage. It's amazing that the principal is running a human trafficking operation in this remote ravine. Ms. Julia, on the other hand, was the one target they didn't succeed in laying their hands on. For a moment I was enraged. Sneaking closer to the window, I tried to get more clues. That dead ninny still has evidence secretly. I didn't have time to look for it last time. I still have to go to her dormitory again. The principal's voice was low and guttural, full of evil accents. Hiss, her place is so evil last time. The hitchhiker's comment was like helping the others remember bad memories, and for a moment the room fell silent. I heard the highlights. Ms. Julia left something extremely important before she died. Leaving silently, I returned to the dormitory where Ms. Julia's body was located. The main door and windows of the dormitory were blocked off, so I had to go in through the skylight. In order not to be noticed as unusual, I left the lights on and groped my way inside the dormitory. I couldn't see anything in the room, and after a few moments of acclimatization, I could see vague outlines by the moonlight. After several rounds of searching, what Ms. Julia had left behind was still missing. Just as I was despairing, I felt a sudden, icy chill of fear. Turn back. I realized with a jolt that the posture of Ms. Julia's corpse had changed. The fingertips that had been resting on the sides were pointing at the dusty closet at some point. Chills instantly exploded all over my body and a cold sweat slid down my spine. I felt my legs go weak uncontrollably and I couldn't stand at all. No one has even been in this house since it was sealed, so why is Ms. Julia's corpse still in a different position? In the dark, I felt that Ms. Julia would not harm me, but was giving me guidance. Forcing down the fear in my heart, I groped in the direction of Ms. Julia's arm and soon came across a cold cylinder on top of the closet. A tape recorder hidden in the upper compartment of Ms. Julia's closet. I carefully stowed the recorder and headed back the same way I'd come through the skylight. In a deserted corner, I bawled in the darkness with only one thought in my mind. I'm going to fulfill Ms. Julia's obsession for her. Killing for life. I took it upon myself to find the dog Rohan. In front of the door to the dormitory, the dog Rohan wore a smile that he couldn't hide, a glint in his eye. It's long overdue. Don't worry, I'll let her die right away. His excitement was undisguised and he urged me to open the door to the dormitory quickly. Dog Rohan pulls out a severed rooster. This severed rooster can hook the soul instead of the Ghostbusters. As long as the soul of this corpse is lured away, that resentment will naturally dissipate. Dog Luohan vigorously threw. The severed head rooster flew into the dormitory, landing on the ground surprisingly as if it was still alive. Normally walk up. When he wasn't looking, I threw a scorpion in. The 5 poisons of the scorpion are een and can attract lonely spirits. Now I don't trust anyone, I just want to avenge Ms. Julia's death. The headless rooster that had been circling Ms. Julia's corpse suddenly stopped, like it felt some kind of invisible power. It rampaged across the room and in no time at all, the headless rooster lurched out of the dormitory askew and collapsed to the ground. Dog Luohan's face instantly turned pale, his eyes covered in shock and fear. It can't be. He muttered, how can this be? How can this spirit be so stubborn? He obviously didn't expect to lose his head, and for a moment his face changed. I was so well camouflaged that small gestures went unnoticed by him. The method of exorcising souls won't work now, I must find a stronger means. Dog Luohan didn't want to give up, and there was a gleam in his eyes that I couldn't understand. Guard this house. Not a fly can enter until I return. I silently nodded my head in agreement. The dog Rohan had a resigned look on his face and was surely not going to stop there. The following morning, when the students were in class as usual, a frightening mutation erupted in the school once again. The parents were even more frantic than the last time, barging into the school like a pack of unhinged ferocious animals. Books and textbooks that have just been replaced with new ones are torn up and devoured in a matter of moments. But people who have completely lost their minds simply can't be satisfied. Tables, chairs, benches, blackboard chalk. Anything that existed in the classroom was devoured by them with no intention of dying. Reddened eyes filled with eerie blood, panting heavily like a hungry wolf. At this moment the parents can no longer be called human beings, but beasts consumed by endless desire. The students were not different, but the weirdness soon became contagious. The whole school seems to have become a mental asylum full of twisted-faced chewers. They forget all about their humanity and become monsters. I had nowhere to run as the monsters slowly closed in on me. When I couldn't retreat, I touched the 8 trigrams mirror left to me by the one-eyed half-immortal child. Taking out a mirror, the reflected sunlight, like a nemesis, instantly dispersed the monster. I fled out of the school without looking back, not daring to stop until both my legs were stiff and numb from running. Late at night, I held my breath tightly as I felt my way back to school. At the school, parents and students had exaggeratedly rumbled stomachs and black liquid coming out of the corners of their mouths. Their faces remained twisted and their eyes glazed over like they were going through some unspeakable torture. Worried that something had changed with Miss Julia's corpse, I quickened my pace. Before I reached the door of the dormitory, I saw 2 familiar figures, one-eyed half-immortal and the dog Luohan. They arrived at the school at some point. The 2 men were far apart, both with hard expressions on their faces. At the sound of my footsteps, their bodies moved but did not turn back. They're fighting. Kid, he's going to refine this female corpse into a stiff. Help me, we can't let him succeed. The one-eyed half-immortal's voice was filled with anxiety and threat. I stopped in my tracks, shocked and confused. Don't you cut out your incarnated obsession to confuse the living so that you can do your human trafficking business? Dog Luohan responded coldly, his tone full of mockery and hostility. The half-immortal child and the dog Rohan accused each other of wanting my help. But I've come to realize that neither of them are good. Shut up. I didn't have the patience to listen to them dogfight any longer, and the anger in my eyes spilled out. Murder pays for murder, and anyone who harms Miss Julia will go to hell. My voice echoed through the night with determination and anger. Don't you dare. Unbridled. The one-eyed half-immortal child and dog Luohan had grim faces and ended the fight instantly. Thick killing intent welled up on their faces, like 2 ferocious beasts, surrounding me in the center. I gradually approached the dormitory entrance step by step. Miss Julia, you can finally take revenge yourself. Boom. With a loud bang, the wooden door of the dormitory exploded violently. Immediately afterward, a blurry shadow darted out like a fierce beast. The one-eyed half-immortal child and the dog Luohan instinctively stepped back a distance when they heard the commotion. Upon seeing the shadow's face, the 2 men changed drastically, fear on their faces. The shadow stopped behind me, and it was none other than Miss Julia, who had died in vain for many days. Miss Julia's face was withered, and her arms hung down on either side of her body like 2 black, dead branches. Instead of the usual amiability, there was only twisted and unpleasant resentment on her face. The half-immortal child and the dog Rohan were scared out of their wits. The cloudy whites of the half-immortal's eyes rolled fiercely, and his legs trembled. I've already suppressed her, how could she grow to such a state? The dog Luohan's body turned sideways, his eyes filled with terror, even to the point of running away on the spot. She's stiff. I looked at the 2 men like they were dead, no mercy in my eyes. Not even a single person who died in vain. Your lives, use them to atone for your sins. Knowing that they could no longer escape, the 2 instantly joined forces to fight to the death. The half-immortal child pulled the tattered doll out of his robe, surrounded by a black aura, and faintly heard the heartbreaking cries of the infant. The doll's eyes were hollow and eerie, like they were silently crying out for help. Dog Luohan released the ferocious big black dog and mouthed a weird incantation. The black dog's eyes erupted with a fierce red light, and its fangs flashed with an eerie glow. The 2 of them combined their efforts, and the doll and the black dog pounced on Miss Julia at the same time. A low growl came out of Miss Julia's mouth, and a green-colored circle was thrown out. It's a grass bracelet. The green-colored circle split into several circles of light in the air. One of them lassoed the doll's neck and cut off the doll on the spot. The rest lassoed the big black dog, which struggled at first but soon stopped moving. The shock on the faces of half-immortal child and dog Luohan quickly turned into extreme fear. I didn't kill you. It's him. It's them? The dog Rohan, broken down by fear, knelt down and vigorously kowtowed, and laughed and cursed insanely again. The half-immortal child had wanted to beg for mercy, but it was simply too late to open her mouth. After Julia-sensei's figure floated past, the bodies of the half-immortal and the dog Rohan split in half from their heads on the spot, with stunned stagnation lingering on their faces. Ms. Julia turned to face me, her expression moving with difficulty. I knew it was Ms. Julia laughing. Mrs. Julia? I couldn't hold back any longer at this moment, and bean-sized tears welled up from my eyes. The real murderer must die. I ran all the way to the southeast corner outside the school. A mournful scream tore through the school's night sky, sound waves hovering in the air. The principal's body was torn apart in the shadows. There was despair in his eyes. The accomplices in the principal's gang do not escape Ms. Julia's torture and stop breathing in endless fear. Before I drifted in and out of consciousness, I saw Ms. Julia floating towards me. She put the grass bracelet back on my hand. When I woke up again, I was in the hospital. The police, who surrounded me, launched their inquiries at me, but they eventually gave up in the face of my silence. The tape recorder I carried with me became the key piece of evidence. A human and organ trafficking organization that had existed for 2 decades was completely destroyed. The police officers on the case later told me that when they arrived, the whole school was like hell on earth. Those parents, in utter madness, were consumed by eternal darkness. 26. A few days later I was healed and discharged from the hospital and found a small burial plot for Ms. Julia. I paid silent tribute at Ms. Julia's grave. I stroked the grass bracelet on my wrist. It was trembling slightly.